If you grew up working class in 1970s Britain, you probably didn't describe it that way at the time. You just called it life. You didn't stand in the kitchen thinking, this is working class culture. You were thinking, what's for tea? Can I go out? Where's my other shoe? Why is the hallway freezing? And who used the last bit of hot water? That's the thing about class in Britain, especially in the 1970s. It wasn't always announced. It was felt. In the house, in the routine, in the way money was talked about, or not talked about, in what got fixed instead of replaced, in what was considered normal, in what you were expected to handle without fuss. So this video isn't about stereotypes, and it's not about mocking anyone. It's about recognizing the real signs, the everyday patterns, habits, phrases, and realities that often meant you grew up working class in 1970s Britain. Some of these signs were about money, some were about pride, some were about survival, and some were about a kind of toughness and humour that people from that world still carry today. And if this was your childhood, you'll know something strange happens when you hear these details. They don't just sound familiar. They sound like home. The first sign usually starts with the house itself. 1. The house was lived in hard, and every room had a job. Working class homes in 1970s Britain weren't designed as lifestyle spaces. They were functional. A terrace, a semi, a council house, a flat. Whatever the family had, it had to work. Rooms were used properly. Furniture was used for years. Storage mattered. Nothing existed just for display, unless it was in the best room, and even that had a purpose. You learned early that homes weren't museums. They were machines for family life. Coats in the hall, shoes by the door, laundry drying somewhere, a table that was always doing something. Tea, homework, bills, ironing, peeling potatoes. The house wasn't tidy because people were lazy. It was busy because people lived there. 2. There was often one warm room in winter. If you know, you know. The living room sheets, or front room, was where the heat was. Not necessarily because anyone wanted family time, but because heating the whole house wasn't realistic for many families. So in winter, life narrowed into one zone. Fireplace, gas fire, electric heater, whatever the household had. Doors closed, curtains drawn, jumpers on indoors. Hot drinks on repeat. You learned the map of warmth. Living room equals manageable, hallway equals cold, bedroom equals survival. That one warm room reality is one of the strongest signs of a working class 70s childhood, because it shaped everything. Where people sat, where they argued, where they watched TV, where they fell asleep. 3. Put a jumper on was central heating. This wasn't a joke line, it was policy. If you were cold, the first answer often wasn't turn the heating up. It was, put a jumper on, put socks on, stop standing there with the door open. Working class households often treated heat as a resource, not a background setting. Fuel cost money. Electricity cost money. Waste was stupidity, so comfort was managed through habits before spending. Layers first, blankets first, kettle on, then maybe the heater. That mindset stays with people for life. Even later, when they can afford more, they still hear that voice. Don't waste heat. 4. You were told to finish your food and not waste anything. Food waste wasn't just bad manners, it was almost moral failure. Not because parents wanted control for the sake of it, but because food cost money, shopping took effort, and many adults in the 70s still carried post-war habits from their own parents. So you heard things like, eat what's in front of you. Don't waste it. There's nothing wrong with that. Leftovers mattered. Bits and pieces got used. Toast solved many problems. Tea filled the gaps. You learned that food was not content. Food was provision. 5. Clothes were worn, reworn, patched, handed down, and kept good. Working class childhood often meant understanding clothing rules very early. You had school clothes, play clothes, And you got changed. Not because your parents were dramatic, because clothes were expensive and had to last. Uniforms had to survive the week, shoes had to survive the term, coats had to survive the winter. If something ripped, it might get mended. If a sibling outgrew something, it might be passed down. If shoes still had life in them, you wore them. This wasn't vintage sustainability, it was ordinary budgeting. 6. You learned money through tone, not spreadsheets. Many working-class kids in 1970s, Britain knew exactly when money was tight, even if adults never sat them down and explained it. You could hear it in the tone. Not this week. Put it back. We'll see. Wait till payday. You learned that some days were different from others. That shopping changed near payday. That bills mattered. That certain treats were occasional, not automatic. And because many families didn't discuss finances openly in modern therapeutic language, kids learned by observation. What was bought? What was postponed? What got repaired? What adults worried about when they thought you weren't listening. That teaches a kind of social intelligence very young. 7. The corner shop was part of your life, but so was we can't afford that. Working class kids weren't strangers to treats. Far from it. Sweets, crisps, pop, comics, these mattered a lot. But the relationship to small treats often came with limits. You might get a few coins. You might be told exactly what to buy. You might be sent for bread, milk, fags or tea bags, and maybe get a small sweet if there was enough change. That if there was enough change feeling is deeply familiar to many people. It taught maths. It taught restraint. It taught that pleasure existed. But inside boundaries. 8. You were expected to help at home because you were part of the household. In many working-class homes, children weren't treated like guests. They were part of the operating system. You helped because the house needed help. Washing up, drying dishes, peeling potatoes, watching younger siblings, running errands, taking bins out, fetching things, cleaning your shoes, sometimes helping with coal or fire prep. Adults may not have called them chores in a modern structured way. It was just, give us a hand. And refusing wasn't usually a serious option. That built responsibility early, sometimes too early for some kids, but often it also built competence. 9. Privacy was limited, and you learned to live around people. Working-class family life in the 70s often meant shared rooms, shared noise, shared space, shared everything. You heard other people's arguments. You heard the TV whether you liked it or not. You waited for the bathroom. You knew when everyone came in. You knew the house rhythm. Modern ideas of personal space didn't always apply. That could be stressful. But it also meant people developed a sharp ability to read moods, read timing, and find tiny spaces for themselves. A chair, a corner, a walk outside, a few minutes with the radio, a quiet cup of tea. 10. New things were a big deal. This is one of the clearest signs of a working-class 1970s childhood. A new coat, a new pair of shoes, a new bike, a new TV, new carpet, even a new kettle. These weren't invisible upgrades, they were events. People noticed. They talked about it. You were told to look after it, because if families weren't constantly buying things, then the things they did buy carried weight. You didn't rip open a new toy and forget it in an hour. You used it, protected it, showed it off. Scarcity made value visible. 11. You grew up with noise from work in the background. For many working-class families, work wasn't abstract. It was physical. Factories, building sites, transport, trades, cleaning, shifts, uniforms, tiredness, sore backs, early starts. Even if you were a child and didn't fully understand the job, you understood the effects. Dad coming home exhausted, Mum timing everything around work and the house, shift patterns changing family rhythm. Clothes smelling of smoke, oil, dust, food, or the workplace. Work was in the house, even when work happened somewhere else. And that shapes how kids see adulthood, not as self-expression, but as duty. 12. You learned humour as defence. This is a big one. People rarely explain properly. In many working-class homes, especially under stress, humour wasn't optional. It was emotional technology, jokes at the table, sarcasm, teasing, taking the edge off bad news, laughing at things that weren't really funny because the alternative was sitting in fear or shame. That kind of humour could be rough, sometimes brilliant, sometimes harsh, but it taught people how to survive embarrassment and difficulty without collapsing. A lot of British comedy comes from this exact environment. 13. Respect mattered, especially in public. Even in homes that felt chaotic, there was often a hard line about behaviour outside. You didn't embarrass the family. You didn't answer back to certain adults. You said please and thank you. You respected neighbours. You represented the house when you were outside it. Working-class communities could be close-knit, and reputation travelled fast. What you did in the street might be known before you got home. So kids learned that your behaviour wasn't just yours. It reflected on the family. That could feel strict, but it also created strong social awareness. 14. You knew the difference between having enough and having money. This is subtle, but important. Many working-class kids would say they didn't feel poor all the time. They might say, "We had enough. We managed. We weren't rich, but we were all right." That language matters, because working-class life often involved pride in coping, pride in keeping the house going, pride in clean clothes even if they were old, pride in feeding everyone, pride in paying your way, pride in not pretending. So one sign you grew up working class in 70s Britain is this. You learned that dignity and wealth are not the same thing. And that lesson, for many people, stays powerful forever. 15. Making do didn't feel like a philosophy. It felt normal. The strongest sign of all may be this. You didn't think your family was doing something special. You thought this was how life worked. Things were repaired, meals were stretched, rooms were shared, heat was managed, clothes lasted, kids helped, adults carried on. That phrase, carry on, is doing a lot of work here. Because working-class Britain in the 1970s was not one single experience, and we should be honest about that. There was hardship, there was inequality, there was stress, there were families struggling badly. But there was also competence, humour, community, and a kind of realism that produced very capable people. So when people look back and say, you can tell who grew up working class, sometimes they're not talking about accent, they're talking about habits. The way someone saves wrapping paper, the way they hate wasting food, the way they can make a meal from almost nothing, the way they offer tea before asking questions, the way they notice if a room is losing heat, the way they respect workers, the way they don't panic when life gets uncomfortable. That's class memory. And in Britain, it runs deep. If you grew up working class in 1970s, Britain, the signs aren't just in old photos, they're in your instincts, in the way you think about money, in the way you treat food, in the way you run a home, in the way you read people, in the way you laugh under pressure. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always fair, but it built something real, and for many people, that reality still feels like home.